It's that you develop a technology to try and solve something, and then you never even look at the problem anymore. And the technology becomes the device to avoid looking in the mirror and seeing something other than yourself. And this is precisely what the modern, I think, produces in its response to the climate crisis. So that image, again, that Parmigianino, comes back to us in the 21st century and goes, okay, that's the problem. That's what that image can represent. That's why I think it becomes such a fascinating image in a way. I should borrow it for an exhibition one day, maybe. So why would you start with a museum? Or why would a museum be a place that's important to this? Let me suggest that actually the museum is one of the institutions that are responsible for producing the norm, the rules. We talk about the rules in this title, the rules of social engagement. Because these museums, as they exist, produce separation, modernist forms of separation, not of entanglement, not of relation, but of separation. And this is, I think, relatively simple, The National Museum produces the division between the citizen and the alien, the person for whom it is their story, and the person who is looking from the outside at the story of another. The Natural History Museum produces the division between the human and the animal, the humans who are entertained by the natural world. The Ethnographic Museum produces the distinction between the centrality of the white human and those other humans. Now, why is the Ethnographic Museum not combined with the Art Museum? Because this division wouldn't be demonstrated if that combination was made. The Art Museum, this is maybe getting a little bit more contentious, is a place which not only reflects on bourgeois culture, but indeed creates bourgeois culture. To walk into the Art Museum is to declare yourself, in a certain sense, to be cultured, to be bourgeois. You generate your class identity. Rather than simply have it acknowledged, it's generative. And of course, those people that don't walk in are uncivilized. And the Modern Art Museum, in this process, which we'll go on to a minute, by Alfred Barr, who invented the Modern Art Museum in New York in 1929, and said in this really quite absurd way now, if we look back at a modern that is already past, said, modern art has nothing to do with art from the past. We're going to make a line. We're going to make a line. Let's have a look where it happens. In 1890. And we're going to say that beyond that, there was nothing. And this category, already we can argue, as Eric does very forcibly, that art as a category is itself fairly useless now. But modern art, for God's sake, I mean, are we so desperate to discipline ourselves that we can't even see the relationships between a Frans Hals or a Rembrandt or a whatever and the kind of art that's being produced now? Alfred Barr says, Parmigianino, I as a modern art curator shouldn't be able to talk about him. He should be beyond my ken, beyond my knowledge, because the knowledge is focused in this way. So the Modern Art Museum is in some ways kind of a little bit absurd. And the Modern Art Museum has, I would suggest, just this difference between the modern and the traditional. And remember that Alfred Barr, in doing this diagram, and I want to spend just a tiny amount of, how am I doing for time, actually? I lost track. 20 minutes? Then I have enough time to look at this. Again, I don't know whether you can see it, but which is a shame, really. But what you see in this is a diagram for a book that's produced in 1936 for an exhibition called Cubism and Abstract Art. This is a diagram that Alfred Barr makes in order to show what the Museum of Modern Art is going to come and represent. And I think it's important to say that Museum of Modern Art as an institution is more complex than this. But in some sense, it's very much more complex than this. It includes design. In the Second World War, it produced, really, I think, important, entangled, inclusive exhibitions, which then were rather lost in the subsequent period. But there were periods where the MoMA was much better than this, in a certain sense. But nevertheless, this is something that represents our tradition, which we inherit as something like the Van Abbe Museum. This is, in a way, the template that was laid down after the Second World War on every museum of modern art in American-occupied Europe, let's call it. that this was the template that became the export system. There was another template that Alexander Dorner tried to develop in Hanover in the pre-war period that failed. It didn't fail because it was worse, in the contrary, I think, but it failed because of geopolitical power of the United States allowed this to be imprinted. And also the absolute and utter ethical bankruptcy of Europe in 1945 had a lot to do with the fact that there was a desperation to suck in something which was somehow not soiled by the ideology of fascism, which is something that produces only sort of excrement, essentially. Was not soiled by that ideology and therefore could be seen to be innocent to a certain degree, could be seen to be incorporated. So there are very strong reasons why it was done, and it's not about, I'm not a sort of complaining about American imperialism, particularly here. It's rooted in other origins, and the advantage was taken to impose this, again, very willingly. The American occupation was a willing occupation. The Soviet occupation was, after a few years at least, an unwilling occupation. This image is interesting because there are a number of other versions of it, including one in my own museum, in Van Abbe Museum, which also trace a similar diagram, adding a few local Dutch spices into the mix so that it was seen to be also relevant to a town like Eindhoven. But it excluded one important thing, and I think this touches on colonialism, but also on the critique of the colonial within the modern system, and its inadequacy, but also its presence. There are 4 red boxes in this diagram, which say inside of them, I don't think you can read them, so you'll have to believe me, Japanese prints, Near Eastern art, Negro sculpture, excuse me for the word, but that's what's written, Negro sculpture, and machine aesthetic. And these 4 are Alfred Barr's very noble, very intelligent, very thoughtful attempt to understand that modernism, we're not talking about modernity here, we're talking about modernism. Modernism incorporates things which are outside of itself. So in a sense, a step forward from Galeano. There's a recognition of the Babylonians and the Mayans. But what is that recognition? Or what's the problem of that critique which is caught within this image? Is that they're in these red boxes, that they're not identified with places, with names, with agency, we can say. That in a way, the material that's within these red boxes is inert material. It has no capacity for activation beyond the inspiration that it might provide for the modern subject. So if you are an artist in Lebanon, if you are a sculptor in Nigeria, if you are a printmaker in Japan, how do you put yourself in this map? How do you become modern when you're already subscribed into a red box in which your only purpose is to provide the energy to reignite the modern experiments after the Second World War? And so here we see both the recognition, the criticality, if you like, of Alfred Barr, the capacity to understand, much more so than many of his contemporaries, the drawing that we have, which is the basis of our collection in our museum in Van Abbe, has no Japanese prints, Near Eastern art, Negro sculpture. They aren't there. So let us celebrate the fact that they're there, but let us also understand how they're there is part of the problem, let's say, part of the issue that we need to address. And part of what I would call then, and I haven't spoken too much about it, is the demodernizing move, the demodernizing possibility to understand this. Because obviously these boxes need to be opened up. Not only they need to be opened up, but if you do open them up, the whole drawing goes. It vanishes. There's a sort of blankness. There's a Russian artist, maybe appropriately a Russian artist, who's produced a drawing of this with all the words taken out. You just have the lines. And that's a rather sort of beautiful drawing in a way, because I think that's the responsibility. And then what we do with the lines is maybe a question for research, and how we might turn them into something meaningful. I'm sure we need to turn their directions. Maybe they need to point upwards instead of downwards, or whatever. We need to think about what was past in terms of what we write